Hello, I'm Dr. Foojan Zeine, and welcome to the Inner Voice Show, the show that's about you and what matters most in your life. In this show, I talk and interview experts in the field of psychology and in the field that handles your life and everyday life. So today I'm really excited to have Dr. Robert Schwarz with me. Let me tell you a little bit about him before you meet him. So Dr. Schwarz has been a licensed psychotherapist, psychologist for 30 years and has a private practice actually in Ardmore, Philadelphia. He's an author of a couple of books, We're No Fun Anymore, Guiding Couples to a Joy-Filled Marriage Through a Power of Play. That's fun. That was published 2011. Tools for Transforming Trauma, published 2002, and is a co-author of the book PTSD, A Clinical Guide, which was published in 1991, as well as numerous articles and papers. Now, Dr. Schwarz has organized over 20 conferences on Ericksonian hypnosis, brief therapy, trauma treatment, and energy psychology, and he's trained over 20,000 therapists. Currently, he is the executive director of the Association for Comprehensive Energy Psychology and is a nonprofit association, over 1,300 health practitioners throughout the world that use energy psychology. And for fun and creativity, Bob is a singer and a songwriter, and he's performed at several large conferences. Welcome, Dr. Schwarz, to my show.
Hi, Foojan. How are you?
I'm doing great. I just learned something new about you, and I was in a conference with you, and I didn't hear you perform, so I got to come to another conference.
Yeah, I know. Jeff didn't want anybody performing.
I guess so. Well, we'll miss it, and hopefully you'll even perform for my audience on TV one day.
Who knows?
Who knows, maybe. So we had met in the conference, and I sat in one of your lectures. And then as I was talking to you, I know that you are also the president of the director of the Association for Energy Psychology. So there are a couple of things that we would like to talk about today. One is your view on trauma, because you've worked so much and you research so much on trauma, and some of your books are about trauma, but also about the energy psychology, EFT. And so let's start with trauma. And tell me about your research on trauma and what you have found that might be different than what the public or my audience know.
Well, that's an interesting question. You know, one of the things about trauma that, again, that people don't necessarily know is that you can have what I call either big T trauma or little T trauma.
Yes.
So everybody knows what big T trauma is. That's when you're raped by Cossacks or some really horrible thing that everybody, you're stabbed or a hurricane comes and wipes out the town. And so that's normal, everybody understands it. But then there are these things called little T traumas, which really are really anything, any kind of event that is more than you can handle at the moment. And these things get stuck in us. And sometimes they go away, and sometimes they don't. So this could be something like the example I often use is you're in kindergarten and you stand up in front of the group of the kids to recite something, and your flies down, or something happens, and all the kids laugh at you, and you're mortified, and then maybe later the person has public speaking issues, and they might not even remember about that event, but it still affects them.
And when you're talking about the big trauma or the little trauma, the big trauma, many times as the people have spoken about it, is when you experience some sort of a life and death concept, like you're facing huge injury or you're facing death, whether you're imagining you're facing death or in reality you're facing death. And the little traumas are more about something that it really hurts you at that time, and you've many times you feel powerless against what's happening. Not necessarily as powerless as you are toward death, but still powerless enough so that you feel and you hold those trauma in your body, in your psyche, and it gets locked because at that moment you feel so powerless, you don't know how to handle it. And because of not knowing how to handle your emotions at that time or be able to act so that you can get out of that situation, somehow you hold and you maybe even compartmentalize. Can you say a little bit more about how, for example, PTSD gets created in a way, and how do we compartmentalize?
Well, generally, so, if you're walking down the street and you slip and fall and you break your leg, the bone breaks, snap, it happens in a heartbeat, right? But post-traumatic stress injury doesn't usually work that way. It usually takes some time for it to work its way to become a problem. So that's one important difference. So how many resources you bring to bear, how you respond to it. One of the things that sort of happens for folks, and we'll probably talk about this a little later, is like when people are in the armed services, they have a lot of trauma reaction, and the ecology of the culture is just tough it out, right? And so if you have any kind of reaction, you're not supposed to, according to whatever the culture is. And so that becomes, and then you sort of feel bad about it. You react. You have a negative reaction to your own reaction, and it sort of snowballs down the hill. And even the very name of calling it a disorder is sort of a problem, at least when you're talking to big T trauma, because if you're going door to door and in some place, or there's bombs are falling all over the place, your body's having all kinds of biological reactions.
Right.
And it does cause trouble. And that's think, normal. That's the thing. Right. It's normal. That's the thing that I think that most people don't get. One of the biggest interventions that I've done over the years, and I never cease to be amazed by its power, is just to explain to people, what you're going through is a normal reaction to really difficult and challenging events.
Right. And does changing it from a disorder concept to an injury concept, as you were talking about, does that also change from a disorder being a lifetime concept that it's not going to change versus an injury being something that it might be short term and something that is normal as that incident has happened, and that it can be healed and completed? So you don't have to live with the trauma for the rest of your life. It has its effect, but you don't have to live with it, and it can be healed.
Well, just changing the name, I'm not sure does it. I think part of what goes on is, the reason I bring it up is it became news in Alaska recently. They made a thing about this because a lot of folks, when they hear the word disorder, just the lay public, that makes them feel more badly about themselves. So there's stigma, and they don't seek help. So that makes it last longer. The research is, for a lot of folks, they don't get the best treatment. And so sometimes this stuff does last a long time. And if you call it a different name, that isn't necessarily going to solve the problem. That said, when you get the right kind of treatment, and as we'll talk about energy psychology shortly, which is one of the really good treatments, it's amazing how fast this stuff can be let go of. I think the thing that I would stress is it's a natural process, and the biggest problem is that we get in our own way of the healing process. That's what you were talking earlier about, compartmentalization. We try to stuff it in the closet, so to speak, and then it keeps banging on the door to get out.
Exactly. You talk about energy psychology, and there are different names also for that, and I wanted to ask you, what are the differences between them, and what are the similarities between them? I know I was trained by Callahan on thought field therapy, which was TFT, and then there's also EFT, the emotional field therapy, and then now it's also called energy psychology. Some people just call it tapping, and it's a tapping therapy. And so there's so many names for it that it's been out there. Can you please explain what are the differences between these types of therapy, or are they just pretty much similar and each person really took some parts of it and made it into kind of a theory or an intervention?
Well, let's talk. Let me first talk about how they're the same, and then we'll talk about how they're different,
okay.
And especially in relation to other therapies. So, if you go to a kind of a standard talk therapist, what they'll do is they'll talk with you and you'll talk about your issues, whatever it is, and it has its benefits. I certainly do that sometimes. What energy psychology approaches do, and energy psychology is the umbrella name, is generally the way it works is that people focus their attention. The practitioner will ask a person to focus on a difficult or traumatic event, whether it be a small T or a big T trauma. And then they will stimulate, as they're focusing their attention on it, they will stimulate an energy point. Now, you mentioned tapping. There are tapping points, like TFT, which are, so for instance, see, this is like I'm tapping on some acupuncture points right now. These are active, right? So this is what, the treatment might look like. So there's those approaches. There are other approaches. There's something called TAT where you hold a pose and you're activating different points while focusing on an event. And what happens, and there's a little more to it, but what happens is the stimulation of these energy points seems to move the stuckness in the system, because anybody will experientially know that if you have something that bothers you or makes you anxious or whatever, it's upsetting, every single time you think about it, if you allow, you'll feel that your body will well up with all kinds of sensations and emotions. And then some people will try to, again, compartmentalize it and push that away, but that's because they know what's going to happen if they let themselves feel it. So this stuff stays stuck. It doesn't move. But what happens with these approaches is the material moves. And so after a very small amount of time, and when I say small, it could be as little as 20 minutes, could be an hour, an entire event. Like if it bothered you on a scale of 0 to 10, 10, by the end of it, it might be a 0 or a 1 or a 2, and people just all usually are like, "What the heck? That doesn't even seem possible."
Now, when you said it moves the material. What do you mean by that?
Well, what I mean is, yeah, right, fair enough, good question. What I mean is, it moves the. It depends. It moves the energy. It moves the it depends if you want to use an energy metaphor or if you want to use a neuroscience metaphor. But the stuff that stays in there. So when somebody thinks about the time they, were beat up, or whatever, and every time they think about it, their stomach turns and all that stuff that happens. We have the person focus on it, but we don't want them, like abreacting, but as they tap, those feelings just start to vanish. And you'll sometimes get like a layering. So you'll have this feeling here, and then that's gone, and then there's another piece of information, right? So sometimes people remember things that they've forgotten about, sometimes really positive things that they've forgotten about. That happens a lot. So, but by the end of it, the person generally is, can think about the event, and their body and their mind stays calm. And so all of these approaches share that commonality. And they're very rapid. And frankly, I tell people they're a little weird. It's a little strange. I mean, really. I mean, I go and talk to folks all the time. And it's like there's no way around the fact. There's no way around the fact that it's just a kind of strange procedure to tap on meridian points And all of a sudden, in 10 or 15 or 20 minutes, this problem that's been sometimes plaguing people for years just no longer bothers.
When you say weird, it's funny because I went to Palm Springs and I studied with Callahan and I got a certificate for TFT. And it was at the beginning to go and tap and look at all the algorithms that they were giving us. It does appear a bit odd when it comes into the world of psychology. But I think that because of knowing acupuncture and going to acupuncturists, knowing where the meridians are, it's people who've done meditation and yoga. Some of those people kind of understand where those energy blocks might be and how it can be opened up. But you're definitely accurate about when it comes to the world of psychology. It's been 100 years of communication and conversation of two people sitting. And I remember when I studied EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, and the hand movements of the eye were weird. And then at one point, I started tapping on the knees because it was easier for the clients to process emotionally. So obviously, there's something that goes on in the body that holds. When you said it holds, and something that I was perceiving, and I want to share it with you and see how. Is this also part of your experience, that when there is a trauma, that there's some sort of a, like you said, a neurological base that everything holds in a particular way, such as it gets frozen in a particular way. So a particular thought, a particular emotion, which, you feel it in the system, and then at that moment, whether you're reaction is to behave a particular way in order to survive, and all of these pieces, which is your thought, your emotion, different types of sensations in your body and different locations in your body, and a particular behavior gets frozen, like a freeze frame of that. And then when you go back, it all comes together, and they all show up the same way at the same time every time you visit that trauma. And I'm hearing from you that when you find which meridian points to tap and release, somehow you're releasing this blockage that has gotten frozen together as a package, as if like you're opening the box, you're opening the package, you're taking different parts of the package and taking it out. So therefore, it's no longer assembled as a package in your system, if I'm using the analogy semi-accurate.
No, I think you're doing great. In fact, it's the problem with sometimes talk therapy is exactly the problem that you talk about it, because the memory comes up, you feel just as badly as you did the last time, and so then the memory goes back into the body, and you're in some ways worse off. So, but if you can, and there's a whole neuroscience to this about how to change the experience of memories. It's called memory reconsolidation, which maybe is a little more technical than most of your audience would care about. But here's the point. If you do it right, if you bring up the memory and you do it a certain way, and you can change the way the person experiences the memory, like they're calm. When the memory goes back in the box, if you will, it goes back changed forever. So the next time it comes out the new way. So it's not like you have to do it again and again and again. That's the really cool thing.
Because when it gets disassembled, then it doesn't by itself reassemble. It got disassembled and got repackaged. And therefore, the original assembly that was there is no longer there, because you went and looked at the memory, you disassembled it, you reconstructed or reconciliated it with other ways of other feelings that were in your body, other thought processes, other feelings, and now it's a new way of being every time you go back.
Right. So the old model of memory it's a videotape. And the memory's on a videotape, and every time it's exactly the way it is on the videotape. But science now knows that's not really the way it works. that it's more like a fancy computer program,
Mm-hmm.
that the bits and pieces of the memory are put into storage, and there's a program that says, okay, bring up the memory, bring up a little of this and some of that, and bring this up with it, bring up that up with it, and it reassembles.
Right.
And but you're changing that program when you do it this way.
Right.
And so, bottom line is, you're absolutely right. If the person doesn't have, if they treat it once and it's successful, they don't have to treat it again.
Now,
So that's kind of cool. That's really exciting.
I know that there are books and articles that have come up and just kind of showed people in regular ways of, okay, tap here, tap here, tap here, here, and you just kind of your body, and they're very normal. But at the other part of the therapeutic aspect of this, not just the self-help model of it, where you can learn how to tap and kind of release the tension that is there. In the therapeutic aspect of it, there's also an assessment part. So you, as a therapist, you do an assessment of what is the trauma. Is it a big trauma? Is it a small trauma? What parts of what needs to be tapped? And right. So tell me a little bit about how and what you look for when you assess for the issues that a client comes to you, and that you make a decision about what to do in the world of energy psychology.
Well, it sort of depends. So yes, let me just touch base. The whole self-help thing is very cool. People can get a lot of benefit from working on themselves. There are books out there, there are videos out there, there's stuff on the internet. I would say that the stuff on the internet is just, from my perspective, maybe a little too effusive and saying all the wonderful things you can get. It's not that you can't. It's just that, it's hard to work on yourself. You have blind spots. Some people, they just miss it. Some people will actually try to do too much, and they'll blow them, and they'll overwhelm themselves. So it's, by all means, take a look, work on yourself. But if you run into trouble, if it's not working all that well, you need some professional help. To answer your question, I think the thing that really makes a therapist a good therapist is assessing kind of where to go in unpacking the negative events. Sometimes it's not even that. Sometimes somebody will come in and say, well, I feel like I'm not pretty, or I feel like I'm not smart. That's the presenting complaint. And you can go on the internet and you'll see people tapping, going, even though I think I'm not smart, they're trying to something really global and general about that. But that's not really a good way to do it. What you have to find are the specific events in someone's life that they use, maybe unconsciously, to reinforce this belief that I'm not smart. It could be that their father yelled at them, said, "You idiot," or it could be that this time they got an E at a class and everybody laughed at them. Whatever it is, and you would want to treat each of those. So one of the things that a professional does is help break it down into smaller bits so that the person can see it. Some people don't even realize, what the problem is. So, I've had clients come in, and I remember one client, I said, well, have you had any trauma in your life? He said no, which is a terrible question for a therapist to ask. It's too big. But it quickly became apparent, because he had panic attacks, and then the long and the short of it is he did have a near drowning experience, which was completely tied to the panic attack. So I fixed the overcame that problem. But it just was a great lesson in going, don't ask really big questions. Because people, he thought he had no trauma. That's not what he thought by trauma, even though almost drowning is a pretty substantial trauma.
Absolutely.
He didn't die, so I guess he figured it wasn't that bad.
Right.
So that's the thing I think that's most important, is sequencing, and breaking it down and finding what's underneath. And you often need somebody who knows what they're doing and has done this before. It's their journey, but you sometimes need someone that's been down the path a bit
before, yeah. And I think you just answered my question, which was in my head, so thank you.
Okay.
What part of the question I had in my own experience when I first learned it had to do with there was an assessment, and the right after the assessment of what is the emotions or what is going on, then there was an assessment of where do we tap on the body and what set you would tap as that.
Yeah.
Sometimes it would release whatever it is for a lifetime, and many other times it would just release short term,
Right.
and it would come back. And I was going to ask you, how come? Have you had that experience that how come sometimes it works only short term and sometimes long term? Now, my assumption is that, as I heard from you, the assessment of where is the issue coming from and finding the original part or the event that actually created, or we created it based on that original event that happened. If we can release that original memory, it supposedly you have higher percentage that it will go away for a lifetime because you just dismantled the whole package. But if you didn't find the original memory and you're just working on more tapping and releasing the surface issues that are coming up, because the original memory is still there and intact, because the original belief is still intact, that it could presumably keep coming up to get released.
Sure. Well, like a great example would be, addictions or cravings.
Yes.
or anxiety. You can certainly tap down in a craving or feeling a desire to drink inappropriately or use drugs inappropriately in a given moment. But if you don't get to the more, I don't know, but I don't like to say the original, because then it's like a little bit like, oh, they have to get to very early. I don't know about that, but you certainly have to get to some key experiences in someone's life that drives their need to use a substance, or drives their underlying feelings of anxiety. There are always events, experiences, internal tapes, things they said to themselves, things family members said, albeit not necessarily with the intent to harm, but sometimes sometimes things just have a way of affecting. So that, again, so that would be another thing. Like, again, if somebody tries it and they feel a little bit better, but it comes back, the number one thing is, well, are you just dealing with what's in the moment, or have you come up with what's driving the urge to, the underlying feeling?
Great. So what is the difference? You talked about the similarities.
Right, we didn't get to that. Yeah, okay, so we didn't get to that.
Right.
Glad you brought it back. Well, if we talk about TFT and EFT, you were trained in TFT. So TFT is the original energy psychology. It was started by Roger Callahan. And Roger believed that, among other things, that the sequence of where you tapped mattered.
Mm-hmm.
So if you had this kind of problem, you tap certain points in a certain sequence. If you have that problem, you tap other points in another sequence. And that was a major. That's one of the main differences between one of the defining characteristics of TFT. And there's also a specific, another advanced procedure where a clinician can diagnose specific points to tap. If you compare that with, say, EFT, which is emotional freedom technique, they use a series of the same set of points all the time, mm-hmm. and then what they do is they spend a little more energy going through the way somebody thinks about things, and so they sort of unravel the problem a little more based on cognition and consciousness, right. And they stimulate the energy system to release everything, versus TFT, which is, at least from their point of view, is much more specific. Do this for that. Do these 6 points or 4 points for that, for that kind of event? That's the main difference. There are some other differences. Roger Callahan came to believe that toxins, energy toxins, things that people eat, can be a big problem. EFT doesn't really buy into that a whole lot. There are other protocols that don't even use tapping. They'll use chakra stimulation, for instance, but they still use a similar kind of way of looking at how you get to the problem. And when you focus on something and then you stimulate stimulate the chakras a certain way.
And when you talk about energy therapy, are you also including different types of energy healing processes, such as Reiki and other types in your association?
Right. So Reiki, there are plenty of other energy healing approaches that are not energy psychology.
Right.
So we certainly have plenty of people who do Reiki in our organization, and plenty of people who do who do energy medicine in our organization, but they are somewhat different. For instance, Reiki doesn't really ask people to zero in on a specific memory, and that they are using energy from, the divine, so to speak. Or
external sources.
External forces, where energy psychology doesn't do that.
Right.
Energy medicine looks at the energy systems of the body a little more like medicine, in the sense that, again, it's like, well, you can assess where things are, you can strengthen certain flows. It's a little closer to, say, maybe acupuncture or traditional Chinese medicine, which, again, don't necessarily focus on specific negative events. They work a little more globally. But, I mean, if our perspective is, it's all good. They're different, and they do different things. I mean, so you can, I always, I sometimes talk about it. Well, what's the point of tapping on something if you eat really badly and, engage in, you're always angry with people and you're always causing trouble and whatever, you're not a happy person. So tapping on a little thing in and of itself isn't, maybe that's not enough, especially if you're not eating right, you're smoking, drinking. So there's a lifestyle that you kind of need to sort of maybe work on as well. But, on the other hand, maybe the reason you're smoking and drinking is you have all this trauma. So.
What I sensed was that Roger Callahan, with thought field therapy, was the first person who brought and kind of connected the Eastern philosophy a bit with the Eastern way of working with meridians, really a little bit with psychology. But it had a lot more of that with it. And then, as I'm hearing EFT, emotional freedom technique, what they did was more, that sort of therapy brought more the concept of assessment of the deeper layers of cognition and emotions, and then did a releasing technique with the tapping. But how you assess the cognition and emotion, which is a psychological concept, is at the basis of it, and it's the assessment that it's important. And then when you find that, then the using of tapping is more of just the releasing concept. And then what I heard from you is, obviously, if you're just tapping on a surface experience, on a moment experience, the tapping will give you some results of releasing. And I've experienced that myself when I've been tired. Many times right before the show, I tap in order just to center myself. And so it can be an immediate concept in sorting. And, I've done yoga, and I do a lot of workout with the, breathing techniques that work immediately in just centering and relaxing your body. But there's also a more deeper and a stronger release when it comes to the solid foundation. If you found the solid foundation of what is triggering all of these things, and then releasing it.
Right, and there are sports people that use these things to get, tapping and other things to get into really good, high performance areas. Mm-hmm. And you can do that in the moment, and then, sometimes they're a little more deeper psychological things, again, what you think about success, all those things. The good news is there are a lot of different ways of using these approaches that are quick, have very, very little adverse effects. The worst effect generally is nothing happens. That's the worst. Yeah. Occasionally people will get a little more upset, but not much. Unlike other kinds of things that can, people can react. So they're pretty safe. They're pretty fast. They did a study with Rwanda, orphans in Rwanda 13 years after the genocide with TFT. They did one session, right, and it pretty much eliminated the PTSD of all these kids. It's just like, yeah, it's like almost beyond belief.
Yes.
But in fact, that's what happened.
Right. And tell me a little bit, and our audience a little bit about how you decided to go from being an Ericksonian therapist or humanistic therapist, being a psychologist who worked with a lot of cognition and have come to the energy psychology, and how you incorporate your own background of the field of psychology with EFT.
Right. Well, I've always been interested in a better mousetrap. I was always interested in kind of consciousness. Hence the Ericksonian hypnosis. Always interested in active treatment. Always interested in trying to find ways to help people get to their goals quicker. And you hear about things, and somebody, I remember my first hearing about Roger's work and thinking, no way, this is ridiculous, and one day they'll, found myself in a workshop, tried it out, hey, this seems to work, pretty amazing. One thing leads to another. For me, it's really about, I really like what Dan Siegel is.
Yes.
I doubt your audience does, but Dan Siegel is this psychiatrist, neuroscientist, who has this interesting thing where he talks about what the mind is.
Yeah, he's been on my show 3 times already. Yeah.
Okay. So what Dan says is that the mind controls the flow of information and energy over time. Simple as that. And so for me, and it's exactly that. I'm interested in approaches that help people control the flow of information and energy in a way that leads them to feel more fulfilled, be more functional, be happier, be more productive, be calmer, all those kinds of things that we talk about.
Right.
And that's how I think about it. So, and I will do, whether it's energy psychology or hypnosis, or just talking with somebody, I'll tell them a story. It's all about helping shift kind of how they think about things and opening up the possibility. Because everyone's had the experience, right, of, somebody just says something to you. They tell you a story. And storytelling is one of the oldest change techniques in the world. And they tell you the story, and all of a sudden, you're just like, oh, I never thought of it that way before. And you're just different. It's not always like that, but that's the goal.
Mm-hmm. I know that you have the association right now. Would you like to talk about the association a little bit and let our audience
if anybody out there is a coach or a mental health professional and finds this interesting and wants to learn more, you can. The association. If you just want to find out, join. You can do that just as anybody, but it's really geared mostly for professionals. So our website is energypsych.org. We also have the 18th International Conference coming up in June, early June, June 2 through 5 in Santa Clara, California. You can get to that by either going to energypsych.org or you can go to energypsychologyconference.org. No, energypsychologyconference.com, sorry. And we also have another thing that we do. It's kind of interesting. People are interested. If they want to learn more of the science of this, we have an online course. The website is energyhealingscience.com. Right now, it's not being offered. We'll offer it in September, but people can go and sign up. You know, it's all online about all the science things. We have all the leaders in the field talking about science. So those are the things that we do. We have a code of ethics. We have trainings. We teach people how to do these things. We even have a trauma relief donation drive going on now. We're working with, we want to do 3 programs one's with U.S. veterans, another is with Syrian refugees, and a third is with people in Rwanda. So that is ASEP-trauma-relief.org. But you can get to everything from energypsych.org. So that's the place to go, energypsych.org. And we'd love to have you as a member. And we have some things for consumers as well. You can look for therapists that do this on our website. We do have a practitioner search that we have several practitioner searches actually that people can look for.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for coming to my show and
thank you, Foojan, for having me.
Sure, teaching us about EFT and how people can actually support themselves, help themselves to release many of the, whether it's a big trauma or little traumas or things that are happening. I've actually worked a lot with addiction, even in this field, with the energy psychology and EFT. It works very well with addiction in many layers, and even the cravings. I remember when I did this, I was smoking cigarette, and I used to, when the craving came up, I used to tap, and the craving went away at that moment. So it was very, very useful for that. So for all of you who are interested, you can definitely contact Dr. Robert Schwarz. You have the website on the screen, and learn more about EFT and
EFT, TFT,
EFT, and all sorts of
energy. It's letters, all kinds of letters.
All kinds of letters, emotional, thought field therapy or emotional.
Breathing technique or tap. It's acupressure technique.
Acupressure, tapping.
Diagnostics and
easy.
There's lots out there. There's a whole world actually.
Yeah, the easy way of calling it has just been tapping, and you can probably go and do you have any YouTube videos out there already about the tapping for yourself?
The one I have out there is on temper tantrums. So if you go energy psychology for temper tantrums.
Good.
It's a fun it's a very short video of what you can do with little kids when they have temper tantrums that don't respond to what you're usually what they usually respond to. Very simple procedure.
Perfect.
It's pretty fun. It's pretty funny.
Perfect. So go ahead to YouTube and check that out. And all of you out there, thank you for being with us. Until next week, create a wonderful world and a life for yourself. Bye-bye.